Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to look at the Roaring Twenties, the period of economic and cultural growth that followed the First World War. We're going to take a look at similarities across a variety of different countries and how this period transformed sort of the global social and economic landscape. So here's our basic objectives for today. Take a moment and pause and take them in, and let's dive into our narrative. 1920s, World War I in general, like many periods of conflict, led to massive amounts of technological growth. We saw different technologies move around. We saw the expansion of the automobile and through mechanized assembly lines. We saw the growth of streetcars and other sort of public transportation. We saw the growth of new medical breakthroughs like penicillin and other sort of antibiotics. And we saw the growth of communication through the increase of telephone lines, radio, things like that. All of this stuff moved around the world and helped to transform sort of the cultural landscape of a lot of different places. And we're going to see new fuels show up in the 1920s, the rise in oil, the dropping off in coal, increase in natural gas usage, and all of these things, leading to substantial economic growth and progress. Here we see in the United States how the telephone is expanding and how the growth of automobiles is transforming American life. So take a moment, pause, and read, and then we'll move on. But this cultural movement was not limited to the United States. We also see we see mass media growing in lots of different places. In the United States, of course, we have the silent film industry with Charlie Chaplin, starring in a lot of movies as his little tramp character. Walt Disney is also creating his new character Mickey Mouse, who you might be familiar with, and you should definitely go and watch some of the early Mickey Mouse stuff if you're interested. As we talked about, German expressionist films sort of have a heyday during this time period with movies like Metropolis and Nosferatu, which you can definitely go watch if you're interested in those. And Japanese cinema also reaches an apex during the Taisho era, especially focusing on traditional samurai epics. They had this interesting style of silent film in which they would show the silent film and then have a narrator sort of narrate what was going on to the audience. And so it was a mix of sort of live and broadcasted theater. And so if you're interested in any of those, you should definitely dive in and try to explore them. There's of course an infinite amount of resources out there. And so you can go and look at any of those at your leisure. Obviously, I'd be showing them in my classroom in here, but I'm not going to show them as part of this video. So feel free to branch out and explore any of these things that you're interested in. Automobile wasn't the only transformational technology during this time period. We also saw the advent of air travel. Of course, the first flight was 1903 in the United States at Kitty Hawk with the Wright brothers, but the debate between lighter than air and heavier than air aircraft was going at this point. So the fixed wing heavier than air aircraft were starting to win based on technological improvements, as well as the incredible expense at trying to fill these aircrafts with helium. Instead, many of these sort of lighter than air Zeppelins were filled with hydrogen, which tended to explode. And of course, the famous Hindenburg disaster in the 1930s really spelled the doom of sort of your lighter than air aircraft. And so instead, we're getting air travel becoming much more ubiquitous. We didn't talk about this during the First World War, but aviation was an important part, at least for reconnaissance and some minor bombings. But for the Second World War, planes are going to become very common, and this is going to become an issue. We also see the rise in airplane stunts and barnstorming, which sort of tells you how commonplace these airplanes have become at this time. And so if you're interested in this, definitely go out and watch these videos. They're fascinating and terrifying, and they really are a new era of technological entertainment that show up in the 1920s. Many countries were also embracing economic imperialism during this time period. Sort of the old style of imperialism where countries take over other countries was becoming less common, although we'll of course see a rise in it for the Second World War. Japan was economically taking over, Korea and trying to expand into Manchuria. Europeans had set up these mandates in the Middle East, creating these countries that were more or less economically dependent on each of these European countries. And we're starting to see the building of railroads across many parts of the world, mostly for resource extraction and, to improve the sort of economic prospects of whatever the mother country was. And so this is also going to be a drive of this sort of economic growth as everyone competes in order to, take their share of the world's increasingly scarce resources. Japan, of course, got some territorial gains in the aftermath of World War I, especially a series of these islands that had previously been German islands. And so we're going to see an increase in sort of Japanese expansion during this time period. But we're also going to see the Japanese, especially during what's called the Showa financial crisis. Japan goes through a banking crisis that destabilizes the Japanese economy. The Japanese are going to become convinced that they need to take more direct control over certain northern parts of China. And of course, we remember that Japan had issued the 21 demands to China in World War I, but the Allies in the aftermath of this are going to deny Japan those concessions, and it's going to lead to significant resentment from the Japanese and a real sense that they maybe just need to take what they want. The Taisho era becomes an era of political instability in Japan, often known as government by assassination. Because of the increasing role of the military and the increasing power of hardliners, we're going to see a series of radical groups like the Cherry Blossom Society and the League of Blood rising up, who argue that anyone who is not sufficiently aggressive needs to be eliminated. And so we're going to see a rise in political assassinations in Japan. And because, as we said, the emperor is not capable of reigning in these forces, these mid-level military officers are going to be able to exert significant pressure over politicians because in the end, no one wants to get assassinated. At the same time, we're also going to see a growth in culture in Japan. We're going to see the growth of sort of westernizing fashions, the rise of the automobile. We're going to see a lot of other sort of European inventions come to Japan. And the technological growth is going to keep continuing. And so Japan is a weird mix of sort of traditional nationalists and modernizers in a way that really only happens in Japan. And so the Taisho era is a very weird era to study in Japanese history. One of the other undercurrents of the Taisho era is supreme loyalty to the emperor. The Meiji Restoration had restored the emperor, and he had some role in the Japanese sort of political system. But the idea that the emperor is the sole embodiment of the Japanese people, and that militarily all Japanese should be prepared to sacrifice themselves for the emperor, is something that begins to be baked into Japanese society during this era. And it's going to be something that really comes to fruition in the Second World War in really some dangerous ways. There's also political uncertainty in a lot of the world. World War I created this quote-unquote lost generation, this generation of very sort of uncertain, unsure people who had had their faith in institutions like religion and nationalism shaken by the absolute devastation of the Great War. In the West, we see Hemingway, James Joyce, F. Scott Fitzgerald publishing books sort of exploring sort of the purpose of life and existentialism. In Germany, of course, Adolf Hitler is arguing that national self-sufficiency is important, and this sense of the rightness and the purity of the German people. And in China, we're seeing the rise of the new culture movement with Chinese writers writing in this new simplified Chinese, trying to explore, what the future of China is going to be and what path they should take going forward, how they should try to modernize and how they need to reunify China and things like that. And so they're also exploring some of those ideas. We also see the rise in poetry, especially poetry about the war in the end of the war and post-war period. This is Wilfred Owen's famous poem, so take a moment, pause, and read it. It clearly shows some of the hopelessness of the war and the pointlessness of the death in the conflict. And in the aftermath of this, you get existentialism and surrealism. You get new artistic movements sort of breaking a lot of the rules and trying to explore what the purpose of life is and changing the ways in which we see things. And so all of those movements contribute to the sense of uncertainty that also permeates this decade of pretty much unrivaled economic and cultural growth. Here's Ezra Pound's The Tea Shop, talking about sort of the etherealness of life and the transience of being. So Should pause and read this, then we'll move on. Women's rights also expand during this time period. The Soviet Union, of course, provides equality for women, at least on paper. As with many of the reforms in the Soviet Union, they exist more in theory than in practice. But the Soviet Union gave significant lip service to its egalitarian sort of viewpoint, and had many women in top positions. Both the United States and Great Britain gave votes to women, and this substantially increased the political power of women, both in the United States and in Great Britain. And we're starting to see gender roles shifting. We're starting to see women going out in public more and occupying more public spaces, women creating more art, more literature, taking a more prominent role in society. In the United States, we see the flapper movement, but we see similar movements in Japan and in China and in Europe, as women break out of the traditional domestic sphere, the cult of domesticity, and take a larger role in society as a whole. And so this was an era of, pretty expanded gender roles and opportunities for women. As far as civil rights goes, most countries did not follow through on that. Germany, of course, is going to have their own spectacular problem with civil rights. England, France, and the other allies are not going to do much to improve the status of people in their colonies. In the United States, you're going to see a series of race riots in the 1919 through 1921 period, including, of course, the famous Tulsa race riot, as African American soldiers come home to find that they are not going to be given the rights they want. We're also going to see a rise in xenophobia in the United States as the United States passes restrictive immigration quotas, and a rise in Klan activity, especially in the northern parts of the United States, pushing back against immigration, civil rights, and change in general. And so, although we see massive economic and cultural growth for African Americans, this really means that they're going to need to focus on developing their own sort of culture within their own enclaves in northern cities, because they're facing pretty substantial racism from the rest of American society. Here's the famous reformer W.E.B. Du Bois laying out the sort of place or the situation that African Americans face in the aftermath of World War I. So take a moment, pause, and read this. And that brings us to the conclusion here. So the aftermath of World War I created a period of massive economic growth, which really did create some profound changes in world society, but left some really important reforms incomplete, and was for a lot of people an era of disconnection and uncertainty rather than unity and economic growth. So we'll leave that there for now. And when we come back next time, we'll do a survey across South and West Asia, looking at the rise of Asian nationalism in the aftermath of World War I. But for now, thank you for listening.